I started asking questions and wanting to know, is there something that we could do differently that might help women? And I got the answer of, well, why do you want to study women? We don't know enough about men.
My name is Mercey Livingston, and I'm an editor at Equinox. It's no secret that most of the research that we have on exercise science, sports, and nutrition is largely based on the male body. There's been some progress in closing the research gap thanks to pioneers like Dr. Stacy Sims. Dr. Sims is a leading exercise physiologist and nutrition scientist who focuses on optimizing training and performance for women. Before we dive into this conversation, we would like to note that the studies Dr. Sims references in this interview are based on cisgender women. We at Equinox understand that this conversation may not apply to all women, but hope that everyone, regardless of how they identify, will be able to learn something new from this conversation. Thank you so much for being here, Stacy.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to get into these questions I have for you, but first, can you tell us a little bit more about your background?
Yeah, so I am a female athlete performance physiologist, and I've been told that that's the easiest way to explain how I came to be who I am with regards to looking at sex differences in training and nutrition, knowing that most of the research in the sports science world has been done on the college age 18 to 22-year-old white man. And I really got interested in this when I was in undergrad. And I started as a poli-sci French major and switched over into exercise phys and metabolism. And at the same time, I was on the crew team. And we, as the women's lightweight 8, would be training just as hard and just the same as the men's lightweight 8. But it would seem that the men would progress and they would get to races peaked and do really well. But it was a little bit more hit or miss with the women of how we responded to training, how we adapted, how we recovered. I started asking questions and wanting to know, is there something that we could do differently that might help women? And I got the answer of, well, why do you want to study women? We don't know enough about men. Or we don't study women because women have a menstrual cycle and it can interfere with the results. And those didn't really sit well with me, nor did the aspect of throwing out my results in our class labs because they tended to be, quote, an anomaly. And most of the time it coincided with being in the high hormone phase where women are not like men. And as I really got into my academic career, I still raced at a high level. So most of my research came from questions that I had for myself and had for my teammates, and couldn't find the answers or would dig into the research and see that there wasn't anything on women. So I would have the availability to go into the lab and try to answer them myself. And I've been doing this for many, many years. And we are now in 2022 and just now starting to see some good research coming out for women along the way of really pushing against the dogma and really trying to get people to understand that women are not small men and saying it's not just a hormonal thing. We are born with sex differences and we need to acknowledge it. We're finally starting to get some traction on it.
One of the key differences in female physiology that affects performance outcomes and results and all these things, we know that hormones can be a game changer. Can you explain how hormones work in terms of the cycles and how it affects training and performance?
Yeah, sure. So if we're looking at a textbook explanation of the menstrual cycle, we say that day 1 is the first day of bleeding and the cycle lasts to day 28, and 28 is the day before your next cycle. But we know a normal cycle for women is anywhere from 25 to 40 days, and it lengthens according to the lengthening of the follicular phase. Now, the follicular phase is the low hormone phase. It starts with day 1 of bleeding, and it goes all the way to ovulation, which in our 28-day depiction of the menstrual cycle is around day 13, 12, 13. So in the low hormone phase, estrogen, progesterone are at their lowest point. Right before ovulation, you'll have a surge of estrogen that helps with ovulation. But at this point, in that low hormone phase, women are, quote, more like men, where we have a lower core temperature, we can access carbohydrate really well from our liver and muscle stores for intensity. We have signaling for reparation. We have better cognitive and reaction abilities. Our sleep patterns are different. And all of this has to do with the fact that the body is very robust to stress. Even our immune system has changed to be more innate to capture virus and bacteria. And the goal of the body is to provide a very good environment for ovulation, for a mature egg to be released to be fertilized. But after ovulation, we have changes because estrogen comes up and progesterone comes up in the high hormone phase or the luteal phase. And we see this in the fact that our immune system changes to be more pro-inflammatory because the body doesn't want to attack implanted egg. The other aspect is progesterone's job is to break down anything that's coming in. So carbohydrate, proteins, fats to provide building blocks for the endometrial lining. So it starts to degrade muscle tissue. It shuttles carbohydrate away from liver and muscle to be put in the endometrial lining. It raises our core temperature, partially because of that pro-inflammatory response of the immune system, but also because we have a greater metabolic cost of building tissue. Estrogen is coming up. It changes neurotransmitters. It changes our sleep patterns. So this is where women are most like women, not like men. And so that's where that confounding variable of trying to study women comes into play when you have that patriarchal idea, male lens of designing research studies. So we get through the high hormone phase, which is day around 14 to day 28, and those hormones drop. And then you have day 1 again, which is the beginning of your next cycle. So again, when we're looking at hormones, it's all about creating a robust environment to support reproduction. But if we take it out of that reproductive aspect and put it into general life and training aspect, we can use these hormones to our advantage when our body is most resilient to stress, the low hormone follicular phase. This is where we can hit it hard and do high intensity and push ourselves in the gym, still recover and get really good adaptations. But after ovulation, when those hormones start to come up, we need to think about dropping the intensity and picking up the volume a little bit. So this is more the steady state work. It's a little bit higher repetition, lower weight. And then the few days before the next period starts, when the hormones are really starting to change right before they drop and we start losing tissue, the body is under the most stress. So this is where we want to think about deloading. We want to look at technique work. We want to look at doing more yin yoga and recovery modalities to work with those hormones and absorb all the hard training from the previous weeks.
Cycle syncing is something that I think I've seen more and more kind of in the mainstream conversation. And some people apply it to everything they do, to how they eat, to how they work, to workouts. And my instinct is that your message with understanding your hormones and your cycle and being able to use it to your advantage when you're training. I think some people, they think it means, oh, women can't do certain things at certain times of the month, or, oh, you shouldn't train, or you shouldn't do X, Y, or Z when you're on your period. And so I wanted to ask you about your point of view on cycle syncing, at least the way that most people understand it. This isn't about limiting women. It's about empowering them and helping them perform better and use the information to their advantage.
Yeah, exactly. I get frustrated because people try to merge performance and training together. So performance can be anywhere from a mental task to actual physical performance like a race. And we know that there is no negative day in the menstrual cycle for performance, the one thing in one day, the one point in time, because there are some nutritional interventions that you can put into play if you know that you generally feel flat on that day. But for the most part, the psychological supersedes the physiological. And we see this in a lot of professional athletes where they're like, oh, I was having a really bad day, but then all of a sudden they like pull some kind of performance out of the air and it was a mental skills. So when we're looking at the research, there is no research to support menstrual cycle differences on performance. But when we look at how we can harness these hormones for training, again, there isn't a negative day. What we are doing is we are working with our body's stress resilience to maximize what we are doing. So if we know that our body's stress resilience allows us to do sprint interval training for 4 or 5 days in a row and still garner adaptations, sweet, do it. But if you're not so resilient to stress, you could probably still do those 4 or 5 days of sprint interval training, but your adaptation is going to be slightly less and you're going to be more tired because you're not really working with the way these hormones support the body. So it's not a limitation at all. It's more of an ergogenic aid that is ingrained in the female body. And understanding it allows you to dial in specific physicalities to get more adaptation without having to put in that much more work. So I see people like, oh, I'm going to change my nutrition according to menstrual cycle, and I'm going to change my meetings according to menstrual cycle. That's getting too much in the weeds and the nuances. But we know from a physicality standpoint, we can look at our own individualized patterns and understand how these hormones affect us as individuals and maximize our training accordingly so that we have that ingrained ergogenic aid and are using our hormones to our advantage and really trying to blow over that myth that women are delicate flowers during their period. And that quote, time of the month is a time to stay away from women, because all of that is a cultural conversation and a cultural theme that stems from years and years of patriarchal historical references of women having to be in the red tent or women not being able to do things, but it's all from a male perspective. From a physical and a physiological perspective, we know that these hormones and menstrual cycle is a way to ensure that women, one, are healthy and they have a healthy endocrine system. And two, have the availability to really dial in and maximize days of stress, positive stress.
How do you recommend that women track their cycles? There's so many apps out there. Do you recommend a specific app?
Whatever works for them. I have some people who have a paper calendar and they put a star on the paper calendar as day one. I have other people who are full data junkies, and so they'll integrate an app with their training peaks so they can have everything in one place. So it's really what works for you as long as you can keep track of you and your symptoms.
Right. And there's a lot of great apps out there too. If you're not as familiar with the specific phases of your cycle,
right,
if you don't know what your hormones are doing, I think those apps can be really helpful because they tell you and then it becomes second nature.
Yeah, absolutely. I am involved with Wild AI, and the reason for that is it's very much education driven, but because it uses artificial intelligence, it learns the woman's cycle so it can feed her individualized information. If you're using something that is an ovulation predictor app like Hello, Clue, and Flow and those kind, then it's only really driven towards ovulation. It's not driven towards how to support you as a female athlete. But there are more and more that are coming out that are driven for the active woman that give them that information. So yeah, it is a good education platform. But I am very aware of today's political environment and how people feel about apps. So if people aren't wanting to go on tracking apps, there are still alternatives to use that don't require them to go online.
The big hot topic right now is we're not really sure what's happening with our period tracker app data, and we're not sure what the future is looking like for that. I know a lot of women that maybe have been using apps aren't comfortable with it anymore. It's a shame because I'm a fan of those apps. I find them very helpful. And
if you go with a European company, you're protected. So there are apps that are based in Europe, like Fitter Woman is based in Europe, Hello Clue is, Wild AI is. So if you're looking at using an app that is a European company, then you're completely protected, and it's all anonymized data as well. It's just trying to alleviate the fears that are being pushed up in today's political environment.
I want to talk about tweaking certain things to your advantage when you know your hormones are in a certain place and you're training or you're going to a workout. So everything that we do at Equinox relates back to our 3 pillars of movement, nutrition, and regeneration. I wanted to ask you about what specific changes or tips you would give for someone that's looking to optimize what they're doing based on their cycle phases. Can we start with the movement pillar?
Yeah, so a lot of women think that they should be able to go hard every day throughout the entire cycle. And we know that we're not algorithms, so that's not appropriate. But say you have a favorite class and you want to go all the time. I'll take a mixed weights and body weight and cardio class for that aspect. When you are in the low hormone phase, this is a time to go as hard as you can, go full gas, especially in the interval parts. You can lift heavier in the weight part. So you really are putting it all out on the line. And don't be afraid. Like, you can really push yourself. And if we're looking at rating of perceived exertion, we know women underestimate what they can do. So this is the time to really push and see what you can do in that particular class. As we get closer to ovulation, if you have a tendency to have soft tissue injuries, then maybe you want to not lift such heavy loads, because there is a slight risk of having more lax ligaments because of just estrogen. But if you're not someone who's prone to soft tissue injuries, then again, you can use that estrogen boost to your advantage and really hit it hard in strength orientation, because your muscles will respond and regenerate really quickly due to the estrogen surge. After ovulation, this is where we get more steady state work. So if we're looking at the early luteal phase, so if we're saying day 14 is ovulation, then we're looking at day 15 to 22, 23. This is where you're going to drop the intensity and maybe pick up the volume a bit. So your weight sets will have higher reps and lower weight itself. Your intervals, you want to try to go as hard as you can, but knowing that your heart rate probably won't get as high as it could in the follicular phase, just because there are limitations in fueling. But if you want to try to get that same high heart rate and that same stimulus, then you just have to have a little bit of carbohydrate. So you need to have a little bit of carbohydrate before you go into the class, or have a low carbohydrate drink so that you're boosting your blood sugar so that you can hit those intensities. The big caveat is those few days before your period starts, that late luteal phase. And some women feel bulletproof right before their period starts, and some women don't. Depends on how fast those hormones have dropped. And that's why it's very individual. So if you're someone who feels bulletproof, that means your hormones have dropped already and you're good to go for high intensity. But if you're someone who feels flat and you have a little bit of bloating and some symptomology of PMS, again, take care of yourself. This is the time to work on technique. Maybe you're going to that same class, but instead of putting weight on the bar, you're just using the bar and going through a really good technique in your lifting motions. And when it comes to intensity and intervals, you're bringing it down. So you're still doing the same amount of time, but not as intense. So if we're looking at that stress resilience that I talk about, it's those last few days before the period starts where our body is not as resilient to stress from an immune standpoint and that physicality and physical stress standpoint. But I'm not someone who can tell you what to do. This is that very individual standpoint and understanding how you respond, which is why I tell people you need to track and understand your patterns. And it might take 3 months to understand them. But then you get a really good objective data information so that you can say, hey, on day 23, I always feel flat. It's not something that I haven't done. It's just the way my hormones are. But on day 24, I feel fantastic. So instead of going balls to the wall on day 23, I'm just going to move it over a day. So there's ways of really modifying the movement. We have a general idea, but it's really up to the individual to understand how her hormones affect her and how her bleed pattern affects her as well.
What are some of those adaptations with nutrition specifically that you can add to what you just talked about in terms of movement?
Yeah, so it's the luteal phase, or the high hormone phase after ovulation, where we can make the biggest impact with small nutrition changes. We can't really regenerate glycogen very well in that phase. So we need to look to eat more total carbohydrates to support high intensity work. Progesterone is also very catabolic because its job is to break down everything to provide the building blocks for that endometrial lining. And one of the first things that suffers is lean mass. So you want to increase your protein intake. And our resting metabolic rate comes up too. So don't be afraid to eat more to support yourself because your body requires it.
Yeah, I think a lot of women get hungrier at certain times in their cycles, and our instinct is to fight that and to not eat when you get hungrier at a specific point when your hormones are doing that for a reason.
Exactly.
Moving into our next pillar, which we call regeneration, essentially that recovery element. How can we tweak our recovery or be smarter with recovery when it comes to our cycles and training?
Yeah, so the big rock here is that nutrition timing is super important for women, especially with regards to recovery. Our metabolism comes back down to baseline levels so much faster than men. It comes back down to baseline within 45 minutes to an hour, where men can have 3 to 18 hours depending on what they did. So to maximize recovery, we need to have some food post-exercise. We were looking for protein with a little bit of carbohydrate. One, that helps facilitate reparation, but two, it signals to the brain that we're no longer in a breakdown state, that it's okay to start repairing, which helps with endocrine health as well. If we're talking about modalities of recovery, in the low hormone phase, you can get away with a lot of stuff, meaning that you don't have to pay as close attention to recovery modalities because your body is more attuned to reparation and more attuned to recovery just by the nature of those hormones being low. But again, when we get into the high hormone phase, we have an elevation in core temperature. We have systemic inflammation from immune system changes. We have more signaling for breakdown because of progesterone. So we want to dial in those modalities a little bit more. We want to look to, again, the protein intake, having regular protein doses across the day, as well as being very cognizant of how it is in and around training. We can look to using cold water immersion post-exercise because for women, we tend to vasodilate after exercise. So all of our blood goes to the periphery and doesn't come to the heart to then go to the muscle for reparation. So a little bit of cold water exposure, could be a cold shower for 2 minutes, really helps facilitate recovery by causing some constriction and making that blood go back centrally to then get to the muscle bed. We can look at soft tissue massage and manipulation through a physio or a chiropractor or massage therapist. Because we have greater inflammation, we really want to make sure that we're taking care of those soft tissues. So if we're talking about one modality of recovery that's not nutrition related, I think the easiest thing to do in the high hormone phase is to do that 2-minute cold shower. That has so many benefits with regards to recovery and increasing parasympathetic drive that improves sleep as well. That is something that every woman should consider doing.
So don't have to jump in an ice bath, but the 2-minute cold shower, I can try that.
Yeah, women are more sensitive to cold. So that 0-degree water that everyone talks about, that's more for the male physiology. But we know that women, if they have 6-degree Fahrenheit, that's cold enough. So it's the cold temperature from the shower that is cold enough to instigate positive changes for women.
Where you mentioned like massage, that could include, foam rolling, getting a massage, maybe a massage gun, like those all modalities.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. And what you said about nutrition timing, I think is really interesting. And I've heard a lot of people debate this back and forth. And sometimes at the end of the day, people say, oh, the research says that the timing isn't as important as overall nutrition. But we know that research is mostly done on men. So that's a specific point of view for women, right? That it maybe is more important for them.
Exactly. Yeah. One of my colleagues and friends, Abby Smith-Ryan out of UNC, she's done quite a bit of research specifically on women. We know that women do better in a fed state. And if you're a resistance training woman, then you want to have some protein before because that kick starts your resting metabolic rate to keep it elevated after training. We also know that timing and that window for women coming back down to baseline is super important. And that's even from research back in the 90s that just got squelched in all of the Fitspo information about intermittent fasting and timing window doesn't matter. But when you look specifically at physiology and how women respond, that window is so important to maintain endocrine health and get adaptations that I think there's a resurgence with quite a few of us talking about.
You brought up intermittent fasting, and so we might get into that a little bit more, but it leads me into my next question. What do you think are some of the most harmful trends in the wellness or fitness space that you're seeing on social media or people are doing or talking about? What's out there that you think is the most harmful for women and their physiology right now?
Oh, definitely the trendy diets of keto and intermittent fasting. There are different supplements and stuff that people take and purport to use, but we know that almost none of the research has been done on women. So there's really only 2 that might work for women. But when we're looking at harmful effects, it's definitely the trendy diets of keto, low carb, and intermittent fasting.
The keto diet is high fat, low carb. Can you talk about specifically why that isn't great for women's hormones?
Yeah. So when we're looking at those, women far and wide need more carbohydrate for existence than men. And women have this big, huge fear of carbohydrate because they fear it's going to make them fat, which is why we have the ketogenic and the low carb, high fat trends that are going on. But when we're looking from that physiological perspective, the brain is very important and sensitive to nutrient density. So we have two areas in the hypothalamus that have these neurons called kisspeptin. So kisspeptin is responsible for appetite and endocrine health. So it's responsible for our luteinizing hormone pulse. It's responsible for estrogen and estrogen pulse. And when we don't have adequate calories coming in from a carbohydrate standpoint, then we have a downturn or downregulation of kisspeptin in the brain. So what happens with that is we lose appetite hormone control and we lose our luteinizing hormone pulse. If we lose our pulse, then we lose our surge. If we lose our surge, we don't ovulate. So women will start these diets and they'll have success for 3, maybe 4 months. But when they start extending it beyond that, they really start having health issues with regards to menstrual cycle function, thyroid function, because of kisspeptin. So when kisspeptin gets downregulated, your thyroid takes a hit, resting metabolic rate takes a hit. Like I said, your luteinizing hormone takes a hit, which then impacts menstrual cycle and fertility. And I hear it all the time, but I've been doing it for years and years, and it's so great. And yes, there are outliers, but when we look at the generalized data that comes from the few studies that have been done on women with regards to the ketogenic diet, we see that all the purported outcomes, positive outcomes of better focus, blood glucose control, better blood lipids, they are not there for women. Women have an increased sympathetic drive, so they're tired but wired. There is an increase in insulin resistance, and there is a decrease in the hormone that is released from fat cells to signal losing fat. And it is actually downregulated. So we end up putting on more visceral fat, that deep abdominal fat, when we are following the ketogenic diet. When we're doing intermittent fasting, we tend to see that women will have a little bit better of our insulin control, but we still don't get parasympathetic drive. When we look at telomere length, there isn't as much robust literature showing that there are changes in autophagy and telomere length when women are doing intermittent fasting. What we do find is women have much more success for longevity changes when they are fueling for what they are doing and having slight calorie restriction. So again, when we're looking at the diets and the trends that are out there that are perpetually harmful for women, it's being pushed by marketing based on male data.
I could probably get on Instagram now and there would be like 5 of these doctors or experts in the space that can read off all these really impressive benefits about intermittent fasting and these diets that you were talking about. Most women don't know that that research is not for them. Not that what they're saying is wrong, it's just that it's not for you.
It's good for men, but not for women.
What are the biggest tips or takeaways you would give for someone who is a member at Equinox? They're coming to our clubs. They're trying to build strength, get stronger, improve their performance, build more muscle.
Eat. That's the biggest thing. And I say that kind of in half jest, knowing that I've been in the fitness industry for so long and I've seen all the trends and very aware of the mentality of calories in, calories out, and doing high intensity work. But in order to build strength and muscle, you need to have abundance. In order to build tissue, you need abundance. And there are so many women who are in low energy availability. We have papers and papers of research on recreational female athletes who are in low energy availability, which means that they're just on that borderline of really bottoming out, meaning that they're not eating enough to fuel just daily life. And then they're trying to put training on. I mean, I have women who come to me who are following a 12 to 1500 calorie diet. And they're like, and I'm trying to put training on top of it. I'm like, that's not even enough to support you when you're lying on the couch watching Netflix and not moving. We have to be very aware that our resting metabolic rate is something that we need to take care of. And it can be anywhere from 11 to 1800 calories, depending on how active you are or how much lean mass you have. So when we start having women who are not eating enough to support daily life and then starting to train, they're not going to get adaptations. So it's being very cognizant of how much protein you're eating, having protein at every meal, making sure that you are coming into the gym fueled and recovering from it. It doesn't have to be extra meal. You can split your meal and stay within a calorie bandwidth, but really making sure that you're on point with nutrition to support the adaptations that you're trying to gain.
Yeah, I think this theme of women underfueling, not eating enough, we know it's a side effect of toxic diet culture and weight loss culture and all these things that women have just been saddled with for so long. And we get these messages our whole lives that we need to be smaller and not eat. And it's really hard to reprogram that.
It is. And still being bombarded by those messages too. They're not necessarily overt, but things that you see in movies and on TV when you're looking at women who are older or women who are in their 20s, they fit this ideal, but then the men don't. Like the men, doesn't matter. They can age and they can gain weight and they're not shunned. But for women, there's this incredible pressure to look a certain way. But when we come down to why people should be exercising and eating, it shouldn't be necessarily to fit that mold of what people think you should look like. It should be to feel good about yourself and to be healthy. And those are the conversations that are so much weaker because the external and the pressure to look a certain way just really supersede the real reason for pursuing exercise and good nutrition.
Absolutely. I hope that we'll make more progress. Unfortunately, there's a lot of problems with this gap in research and understanding women more and giving them better advice that's tailored to them. But what are you excited about? Where are you seeing progress? How is the future looking in this field?
In the research world, there is a lot of conversation about paying attention to menstrual cycle and hormone status, which is refreshing because of the way that the peer groups have come through journal articles. We now have top editors who have come through academia around the same time that I have. And they've been very aware of this discrepancy between men and women. So they're pushing for journals to change as well. But boots on the ground, we're having more and more method papers. We're having more and more conversations in conferences and research roundtables about how we need to improve the research on women, not only including more women, but also the actual research design. These conversations were not happening even 5 years ago. So there's been a big increase in the awareness that is very much needed and necessary if we want to improve health and performance of our female athletes. Not only recreational athletes, but there's that push for Olympic athletes as well. We saw a lot of dropout across the world for female athletes who were broken because the Olympic cycle ended up being 5 years instead of 4. Because they had gone through so much LE and relative energy deficiency in sport, and they just couldn't do it anymore. So the mental health aspect is coming up in conversations. There's a lot of robust conversation within the research world to pay attention and to take care of women the way that we've been taking care of men for so long. So that's really refreshing. There's still a long way to go, of course, but just being able to not be an isolated bubble in these conversations is very helpful because now we have things like the WuSci Alliance that is pulling together Harvard and Stanford and University of Oregon and San Diego and all of those different groups to work on female athlete health and performance research. So you're having major collaborations to really push out robust research. So it's exciting. It's very exciting.
That is exciting. Can you just give a quick breakdown of where you think that gap is when it comes to exercise science and sports?
When we're looking at the research gap, we see that in exercise and sports science, it's as low as 4%. We're looking at supplement information and supplement research. It's maybe 1% of women being participants. When we start looking at more of the biomedical research, we see higher numbers, but there's still a massive dearth of information around women in all biomedical science. So depending on what the topic is, the research topic is, you may or may not have more robust research on women, but we are really trying to push to close that gap. It's just the more male-dominated the topic is and the industry is, the more of that gap you're going to see.
Absolutely. And lots of the research that we've talked about today refer to studies on cisgender women. So I would love to ask you, what is the state of research for non-binary and trans women?
I get this question all the time. Right now, the big conversation is about cis versus trans in competitive sport. And it is very physiologically driven, whereas people are looking at the sociocultural. So if we take a step back and look at the physiological aspects that we've talked about, there's differences in estrogen receptors, and people who are taking hormones may or may not upregulate those. So when we're actually looking at how can we apply a lot of this menstrual cycle research and oral contraceptive pill research to non-binary or transgendered women, we have to look at their own individual hormone status. If they're taking hormones, what is that profile? For the most part, it's going to be as if they were in the low hormone follicular phase. And that is primarily a dose that's going to suppress a biological response for sex hormones. So when we're looking at that hormonal epigenetic change that occurs, then we can look at it as the follicular phase. There are some sex difference biological aspects that we've talked about, like within muscle mitochondria, that's not going to change. So there is going to be an inherent difference, but what it comes down to is the individual. And what is their hormone status? How are they feeling? How are they tracking? And you can dial in, like we've talked about with cis women, dialing in how you feel, how different levels of your own hormone make you feel. And that's based on a lot of anecdotal in the field research, because RCTs and really controlled trials haven't been done in the sports science world yet.
Have you met a lot of people that are working on that or intend to make that happen?
I've met a lot out of UCLA, especially because trying to figure out first how different profiles of hormones affect different people along the age span, when and if they're transitioning or if they've had puberty suppression, any of that, and how that changes hormone receptors. Does it upregulate, downregulate? Are they more sensitive or not? So that layer is coming out first. And then the exercise component, because trans women want to compete. And how does that affect sport? And again, that falls into this really hard conversation that a lot of the sporting bodies are having about cis versus trans and competitiveness. And so when we're looking at how the hormone profiles are working from prepubescent all the way through, we also have to take the eye to these women who want to compete, and then how that might affect their competitive status with regards to when they were given hormones or when and if they transitioned. Because when sporting bodies and people are looking from a competitive standpoint, they're just looking at what is testosterone level or what is estrogen level, but they're not looking at all the layers that these hormones can affect. And so first, we're trying to figure that out. And then people at UCLA are really trying to dig into is how this affects exercise status and competitive status. So it's really in its infancy. And right now, like I said, we just have anecdotal case studies that are coming out. But with the eye from the global movement and the global inclusiveness, we're going to start seeing some more robust research that's coming out. As I said before, it's only in the past 4 or 5 years that we're really starting to see robust methodology to include women regardless of hormone status, or really trying to garner that aspect of the estrogen progesterone perturbations across the menstrual cycle, across oral contraceptive. And that in itself is relatively new. And when we're looking at that, we're not even digging into women who have PCOS or endometriosis, right? So we're talking about cis women who have these other hormone profiles that aren't included in sports science research because, again, it's in the too hard basket. So as we're starting to unpack what's happening in the research world, especially the very male-dominated sports science world, we are starting to see more inclusiveness. But what we're seeing is more on the endocrinology side of things. It's starting to also include exercise research. That outside is going to start pushing in on the sports science, and we're going to start seeing more of that inclusiveness of more women on different hormone profiles, because we're seeing such a widening aspect of full participation. Like we see the biggest and fastest growing population of semi-competitive age group athletes is women. We see it in particular the 30 onward set, and we see that there's this drive for people to do research there. And so it's looking not only at the cis woman, but also what's happening across the board from that global standpoint. Like, how are we going to include more women? We are seeing some studies that are having different subsets. So we're seeing women who are naturally cycling, women who are on OC, women with PCOS, trans women all in one study, but they're in their own cohorts. So we're going to see more and more of that to first figure out what is the difference within those groups before we can start doing a comparison, because we have to understand each of those groups before we can compare the groups. But I'm very hopeful because science is ever evolving, and hopefully the more that we push that male lens and perspective out, and the more inclusive we can be, regardless of if it is woman versus man, race, ethnicity, because it's been driven so much by the cis white man and that viewpoint. And we're starting to see more diversity within the research, again, just in the past 4 or 5 years.
Thank you so much, Stacy. Where can everyone find you and follow you and your work?
Right now, our website, drstacysims.com, DR for doctor, has everything that we're up to with regards to all the courses that we're doing, the books that have been published, the research projects that we're involved in. For day-to-day hits of little bits of information, then social media is the go-to, Instagram and Facebook, Dr. Stacy Sims. So yeah, the big pictures, the website, and then daily snippets are on social media.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time and for sitting down with me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a great conversation.